Okay, shall I begin? Okay, hello everyone, again, in the in-person people and then online. My name is Hazel Kwon. I'm an associate professor and the director of the MIDAS Lab, Media, Information, Data, and Society Lab at Arizona State University. Very wonderful to be here. And to my understanding, this is final presentation. It's a final presentation, but to begin with this final presentation, I will just go with what others did to define what antisocial means, the conceptual boundary of antisociality. So I just did a very quick, brief exercise just to look up the dictionary. What does it mean to be social? And I looked up 3 dictionaries, and then there were 3 common definitions. One, being social means suitable to living in communities. Number 2, being social means being pleasant to interact, prone to getting along, sociable, friendly, something all good about interaction. And then number 3, being social is also something about society. It's societal. Doing something for the welfare of the member of the human society. So if I flip this definitional coin, then now we can see what antisocial mean. It can be about being unsuitable to living in communities, like lone wolf. It can be about something unpleasant to interact, like impolite, rude, hostile, offensive. And also it can be about being harmful to society, like refusing the order of the existing human society or harming the members of the human society. So this is a very simple exercise, but indeed it shows that antisociality is a multi-layered definition involving from individual characteristics to the characters of the interactions, interpersonal relations, and in terms of the societal implication. So based on that, I think we have a more than, it's more than reasonable, right, to conceptualize antisociality or antisocial online behaviors beyond defining as individual accounts of individual deviances, but moving toward antisocial behaviors online as networked communication, right? Being networked, like we said already so many times here, right? It's especially in today's digital spaces, we see many cases of online antisocial behaviors are interconnected. It sometimes form an emergent collective norm, right? Sometimes it is even enacted as a concerted way. More importantly, I want to highlight that it is communication. It is represented in the form of the information or form of the messages, but it is more than being a pure delivery of information, and it is more than simply being an impulsive behavior. Many times, antisocial messages contain an expression about who I am, not just the victim, the speaker's identity. It's an identity marker, thus, it is communicative. There are so many popular agendas. Growing literatures have done a lot of wonderful work, especially understanding social psychological factors as antecedents or consequences of antisocial behaviors. There are so many studies out there, right? And we've done that too. And studying about the frequencies, prevalence, and severity of these phenomena, we've talked and we studied those things, and how we can characterize antisocial narrative. What do we talk? What do they talk? Right? Descriptive analysis of antisocial behaviors and narratives are quite a lot. All are important, right? And then definitely worth expanding. That said, in this presentation, I want to point out 4 additional agendas that I already kind of studied a lot, but which I see great potential for expansion. Especially, in my opinion, these 4 agendas are straightforwardly reflective of this conceptualization of antisociality as networked communication problem, especially useful using digital data as an analytic approach. Number 1, network pattern. I think Philippi already talked a lot about this network analysis. So, and then number 2, sociality of anti-sociality. We also talked about this briefly, but I'm going to talk a little bit more. Intersection between antisocial communication and disinformation and polycentric approach. Let me go with one by one, with empirical research kept in mind and with the digital data-based research kept in mind. So the first agenda about network pattern, we already talked, so I'm not gonna go in detail, but we already know that many of the human behaviors are not an isolated, decision making, right? We are all, connected. We get influence. Just like that, anti-sociality also is contagious. It can be mimicked. It diffuses. How do we approach empirically? Philippe's, talk already showed a little bit, but from the digital data-based empirical research point of view, we do need to obtain the data that basically allows us to transform streams of messages into a form of relational or social metrics data. In terms of approach, we can think about studying a little bit more on micro or social interactional level. Again, Philippe's example was this case. But at the same time, if we can reconstruct cascade network, then we can also talk about the diffusion, right? We can measure the size or width and depth or interlayer, like width ratio, those kind of diffusion metrics, and compare maybe the characteristics of diffusion network between uncivil or antisocial network and non-antisocial network. Another interesting question that we can explore is about sociality of antisocial users. Being antisocial users, it's antisocial because they harm the society. But ironically, what we see in digital spaces is that these antisocials are sometimes form a highly well-functioning communities. They often exhibit surprisingly deliberative and democratic practices. So understanding this sociality of antisocials may also inform why they thrive. How do we approach? Again, from the digital data perspective, we may need to gain some data that comes from within an online community. For example, one of my research was about looking at the communities in the dark web, specifically about those users who uses illicit, illegal cyber markets. We looked at the Tor-hosted illegal forum, and what we see is that, okay, within this forum, it's pretty well structured. These community members are sub-clustered, centered around a specific topic and specific markets. But then we also see some central users. Excuse me, this mask makes me feel a bit of short of breath. So central users tend to traverse across different sub-communities, and then they breach these sub-communities. So they have a pretty stabilized community structure. Not only, in addition to that, we also looked at the discourses and conversational content, not only in this Tor-hosted forum, but also subreddit that was dedicated to one of the illegal market. And we can see that they have a very active, different forms of knowledge sharing. Basically, they form community intelligence. They form the shared knowledge base. And then if they face an uncertain situation like market shutdown, then they swiftly change the way they communicate. They basically trying to understand the uncertainty collectively and come up with the solution collectively. The third question that we can ask is the intersection between antisocial communication and disinformation. I don't have to argue, right, that disinformation has become such a big concern. And then disinformation actors are inherently antisocial because they harm the society. But at the same time, from the antisocial behavior research perspective, what might be particularly interesting is how the organically emerging these like antisocial messages are interpolated into the planned strategic disinformation practices. There can be so many different ways that we can approach this agenda. But if I just think about two ways, one is to make use of the dynamic longitudinal digital data to really show that how the antisocial messages are interpolated into disinformation content. For example, again, one of my studies, it was about looking at the evolution of the conspiratorial narrative surrounding Bill Gates during the pandemic. What we see is that, so basically we collected 10-month-long tweets about this topic, and we did some computation topic modeling in combination with time series analysis. And what we found was the topical cluster that we defined as trolling, basically highly aggressive, offensive expressions of emotion against Bill Gates, but not necessarily containing certain conspiratorial content, tend to arise a bit earlier in time and statistically correlated, like granger causal, in a sense. It's not like perfect causality, but statistically showed a causality to the rise of a more refined, sophisticated conspiratorial content. Again, trolling, those messages that we defined seems to be really made by the ordinary general users. In another study, we also studied about the disinformation operation in South Korea. And this case was about basically disinformation actors employing bots to create fake likes to existing comments, really to manipulate the visibility of the online content. So it was about false amplification operation. However, the data set that we have shown that, so basically these disinformation bots likes loved hostile offensive comments that were written by ordinary users. So basically organically generated, genuine and highly aggressive user comments were picked up by disinformation actors to exploit them. So these are some sort of the example of the comments. They were written all by organic users, but became highly visible because of these massive fake likes that they gained from the disinformation actors. In this case, bots. Another way that we can think about is the opposite. That is, disinformation content or information can also be spilled over into the organically emerging public hostile narrative, right? But that will only be possible when disinformation content does not exist in singleton. It has to appear multiple times, repeatedly across different multiple platforms. In other words, disinformation information has to form the microcosm of a media ecosystem of its own. So in that sense, we can also study by using some data representative of this intermediate network or intermediate agenda setting of disinformation messages. For example, again, another study, we are looking at the networked public discourses surrounding gun control movement. In that case, we are using Facebook URLs share data. And from our data set, what we see is some rise of the problematic information. For example, this one, right? It is a fake news. It's a false information that attack one of the iconic activists in the gun control movement in the US. This news was first published on a site called Gateway Pundit. It's a popular hyper-partisan far-right website. The next day and the following day, we saw that the same idea, same message was recirculated. It took the mimetic processes, taking a similar message frame in smaller online sites. Many of these online sites disappeared. They don't exist anymore, so it's pretty ephemeral. So you can see that, and obviously, this type of message were picked up by another, like basically anti-gun control, public discourses, often become a, weapon to harass those influential activists. And then we have a last agenda about policy impact. We talked about this throughout the whole day. Policy matters. Policy implication matters. But how can we approach empirically? It's not always easy. In my opinion, this is the most challenging part as an empirical researcher point of view. General rule of thumb is that we might want to find some data that show the changes, right, between the condition under the policy in effect and the policy not in effect or different policy in effect. One of the study that me and my colleague did years ago, again, was based on the news comments data in South Korea. And that time, for example, the South Korea had this nationwide law called Real Name Verification System. And there was a time when a court said this is illegal. So the law was repealed. So basically, it was a transition time when news media sites have the choice whether they're gonna keep this law or they're gonna drop it. And at the same time, it was a time when social media plugins were introduced as an option for users to use to log in. So both of these, system basically try to reduce anonymity, which basically triggers the offensive comment. So we think that these are two different regulatory frameworks. So basically we compared which one is more effective in reducing offensive comments. So talking about regulatory framework is one thing, but at the same time, I think under this agenda, umbrella of the agenda, we may also want to think a little bit more intensively about then what these antisocial users will do in response to the policy interventions. Will they remain to be resistant or not? Right? Going back to the example of the illicit dark web market user case, back in 2018, Reddit changed its content policy by strengthening banning market or economic transaction-related content activities. There was in direct response to the federal government's efforts to take down these markets. And indeed, several market-based subreddits were banned, including the one that we actually studied. Did it reduce these illegal market users' activities? Maybe or maybe not. What we see is this type of thread. For example, under one of the subthread called Darknet, we saw a thread called Marketplace Monday. So basically, every Sunday night, the weekly conversations are cleared off, and then they renew and then begin again on the thread as a new thread. And basically, all these market-related conversations continue within this thread. Why do they do? So, not exactly why, but what we saw is that they were kind of successful to evade from the Reddit effort for creating their data repository. So basically, data dump, right? In a way, they helped Reddit to not being able to be accountable for any criminal activities because there's no record, right? And if you actually use the Reddit API to try to download the content from this subreddit, you actually see that Marketplace Monday is turned out always as an empty cell. So I talked about the 4 agendas and having some examples. All are based on my research as an example. However, that does not mean that mine is the best. Right? There are much cooler, better research out there that exemplify these agendas. So please go and find them. It's your homework. And also, I talked about the digital data-based research as an example. That again does not mean to discredit like non-empirical research or non-digital data-based research. Nonetheless, I think it's important to talk a little bit more about digital data again, because it has gained traction. It has become one of the dominant, like, major way to study antisocial behavior research. I think we passed the phase that we find the value of the digital data because it's big, it's large, right? Bigness is less important than being unique, right, as a source of the data for antisocial communication research. So what are the then unique aspects of this digital data, right? We can talk about being unobtrusive, right? Capturing the interaction data. We can travel back in time, the moment of sensitivity, and it also includes dynamic, right, longitudinal clues so that we can trace back the evolutionary aspect. So these are all great aspects of digital data. Nonetheless, we have challenges in using digital data, especially for antisocial communication research. One of the most problematic or concerned aspect is data ephemerality. We see so many tweets deleted, sites are banned, gone, right? Deplatforming. How are we gonna deal with that? So that's a big concern or big question that we have. Issue of privacy. So even at our workshop, we had this kind of example a lot, right? We want to exemplify what kind of antisocial messages we are dealing with, and we try to redact personally identifiable information. Does it really ensure the privacy? Maybe not always. What should we do with that? That's another challenge. In terms of data sourcing, right? What is ethical data sourcing? To what extent? For example, in the dark web, right? If you want to automate the data collection, there's no API thing, so you have to do web crawling. However, many of the dark web sites basically implement anti-crawling software or measures. So in a way, as a researcher, if you want to automate it, you have to be shady, right? You have to find out how you evade that anti-crawling measure. Is it ethical? What about hacked data sources? There are so many hacked data sources out there. Some are really granular, wonderful, so tempting to use. As an academic researcher, are we okay to use it? I don't know the answer. So that's another challenge. Another one, this does not necessarily apply only to the digital data-based research, but I think as a researcher of antisocial communication research, I think we might want to reflect ourselves if we unwittingly commit stereotyping of other social group. This came to my mind very, very recently. I happened to read this article from the Atlantic. The original title was How the Rosary Became an Extremist Symbol. They later toned down to how extreme gun culture is trying to co-opt the rosary. I am a disinformation researcher, right? And I have a serious concern about the gun extremism. I study gun control movement, right? So I definitely understand the motivation of this researcher and this writing. But at the same time, personal me, I was raised from the Catholic family. And of course, there are so many causes that I do not support. However, with my religious background, right, the first reaction of me to this article was a bit of uneasiness, discomfort, and concern whether this article could create another stereotype of a Catholic community, which already have so many bad reputations, right? And then it struck me, as a researcher, have I done a similar thing? So one question. Lastly, I want to go back to the most fundamental of social science theory. Social science theory 101. It has to do with what is, not with what should be. But if you study antisocial behavior, which are inherently bad and negative, I think it's very easy for us to be trapped into this moral illusion that we are doing it rightly because we are studying something that's morally impending. I think we may sometimes want to distance ourselves from the phenomena and try not to be a moral preacher. So that's another one. So these are all I have. Thank you.
So I'm very interested in your last point. So that we should study what is and not what should be. So what do you think then the role ought to be of researchers when we see these issues, which are growing more and more, every day seemingly? How should we conduct our research in order to maybe try to at least create avenues where other people might be able to fix these problems? So then what is the role of social science research in maybe thinking beyond just reporting on what is and doing something to try and make the world better?
It's an excellent question, and I actually have to have no answer because I think we can talk about this, for an entire day, right? The fundamental question is: the social science, are we okay to be an activist in a way, right? And also that this one is actually coming from the social science research practice book, which is based on the positivistic, quantitative, research method, right? So in a way that this one is a sort of the axiom for the persons who are doing heavily empirical research from the quantitative perspective. But then, I think the previous presentation by George also shows that there isn't some changing in social scientists' responsibility, or in terms of how we communicate the findings and stuff like that. So I think there is a little bit of the change in scenery, and in terms of talking about ought to be. I don't know who defined it, right? So I think there's another very complex question there. But I think just personal opinion is that once if you define yourself as a social scientist, then I think once you lose how to distance yourself from the phenomena, I think then we might not be able to take a unique role as a social scientist in the existing social. Because there are other types of careers that actually do other stuff, and I think there is a unique role the social scientists doing, and I think still like distancing a little bit from the the phenomena might be important. So that's sort of my personal position, but yeah, no answer to be honest.
No, I mean that's a good answer. And if I have time for a follow-up, I would love to ask, so then when you are studying some really dark stuff, like that you clearly have, and thank you for spending time in these spaces, when you are studying that, how do you manage the tension between maybe seeing things that are on the edge or maybe over the legality line, and then trying to take a step back and just observe rather than do something about it?
That's another great question, right? What the data, right? The community that I'm looking at are basically all about illegal stuff, right? They are selling weapons, they are selling drugs, but ironically, they have a very strict policy against child pornography. So they have a certain rule within their community, but you really see that all about the illegal transaction. That's so true, right? Do I do anything about that? What? Right. So again, it's a little bit of, there's always the tension, right? To what extent? Should I ever try to communicate with them? Because I'm a quantitative researcher, and then that is sort of an excuse for me not to engage further. But if you want to go with a different route of method, should I contact with them? Should I talk with them to really learn more about their culture? what's going to be the real consequences on me, right? So I think there's just some kind of tension, definitely, in terms of to what extent I should keep myself, from the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Great insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. I was really interested in your project with the South Korean internet and real name policy. Can you just go back and kind of expand on it a little bit? I was really curious if I interpreted it correctly. Just want to hear what you found there. Thank you.
Yeah, so due to the time limit, I didn't really explain the findings. But basically, what we found is, so real name law, compliance is like top down, right? So you have the law, you have the policy, the company impose it or the nation impose it. So it's a top down, it's mandatory. Social plugin is a voluntary, right? You have a choice as a user whether you are gonna use that, to, for your login and stuff like that. So it's a top down, voluntary sort of different framework to manage anonymity. And what we found was quite interesting that actually top down increased offensive comments, and voluntary adoption decreased offensive comments. So that was our finding, and we were kind of trying to see what it really means. And in a way, real name verification does not, how can I say, it's not about using real name in actual interactions. It's about providing the real name to the platform. It's a little bit different from Facebook case, right? Social plugin use, on the other hand, if you use Twitter as a social plugin, or Facebook, you may need to really provide your real name. So in terms of display, there is a little bit of difference in terms of anonymity compared to what anonymity meant to the platform governance, platform executives. So I think that might be one of the reasons that there's a difference in terms of the finding.
So were those offensive comments targeting specific individuals, or you were measuring just general level of?
General level. Again, we used a lexicon-based approach, so we kind of created the dictionary of the swear words, and so that was the. Okay.
Nothing online.
Okay. So, right. Good, Rick.
Well, I guess we can conclude on
you.
this note. Thank you, Hazel.
All right, everyone who has stuck with us through a very interesting, impactful, yet a little bit long day. We always have